Okay, we're coming down to the wire now. First, speaking of wires, final exam in this class scheduled for Tuesday, May 11th, 3 to 6 p.m. in First Gymnasium. That's the old gymnasium, not the other one, room 220. The exam is scheduled for a traditional Berkeley 3-hour exam. It's written as a 2-hour exam, but you have 3 hours for it. I would be surprised if most of you wanted all 3 hours. Must be some good program on at 5 o'clock you want to watch, but you'll have 3 hours. The first hour is non-cumulative portion of the exam, covers material since the last midterm, with an exception that I'll talk about in a second. The second hour is cumulative. There will be about 15 short answer questions on the non-cumulative portion, basically the same as a midterm. And then for the second hour, we'll give you 5 a little bit more discursive questions, but in all cases, we're looking for pretty short answers. Okay, so that's the way it goes. You'll have the third hour available. I can't imagine anybody needing it, but since you do have it available, you're free to take part of it. If there's anybody who has exam conflicts, you should let me know sooner rather than later. Berkeley's policy is if you have 3 exams scheduled on the same day, you have a right to have one of them moved somehow. What you really should do is, if you've got 3 exams scheduled on the same day, go to each of your 3 instructors and see if he or she'll move, okay? And see what happens there. Okay, here are the topics of the non-cumulative portion. Since the midterm, since the break, we've talked about 4 basic topics: the self, social cognitive neuropsychology, the development of social cognition, and today we're going to talk a little bit about social construction of reality. But because the midterm exam was a little long, you didn't really get a chance to deal with the very last part of the earlier segment of the course on social judgment and inference. So we're going to have 5 sections on the non-cumulative portion of the exam. One of those will give you a second crack at the topics covered in social judgment and inference. Okay. So we'll have a review session here next Wednesday, here in this room, in class, from 10 to 11. That's the reading, recitation, and review period, newly invented by the administration in its wisdom. And the way it works is we're only going to have an hour for that review session. That's life. That's just what it's going to be like. There'll be a class in here doing its review from 9 to 10, another class in here doing its review from 11 to 12. So we've got that hour. The new narrative review will be posted by Friday, so that'll be accessible to you before the review session. Do it just like last time. I'll sit up here and take questions, and all the lecture supplements will be updated as well for those of you who are paying attention to those. As usual, if there's some leftover question that you stumble on, I can take the questions posted to the website forum, and the exam's on Tuesday, so we'll set a deadline on Monday the 10th at noon for those. If you post a question to the appropriate forum, you'll get an answer by 5 o'clock that day. Please, again, you were pretty good about this last time. Don't send me queries via email. The whole point of this is that everybody gets the benefit of the response, right? And I have no way of sending email to the entire group without going through a lot of cutting and pasting. So don't do that. Do that instead. Any questions about the organization and format of the final exam? Yeah. Yeah, you'll have some choice. Yeah, I don't know why I give you choice, but I do. So. Anything else? Okay, let's talk about what we've been doing here. The way we usually think about cognition, whether it's cognitive psychology or cognitive science, is that there's our reality out there, and there's our knowledge of that reality that is somehow inside us, inside our heads. And the whole point of having cognitive faculties is to permit us to acquire knowledge of reality that we can use to navigate the world around us. In social cognition, the reality that we're trying to cognize, the part of the world that we're trying to understand, is social in nature. We're trying to understand other people and what's going through their minds and what they're doing and why they're doing it. We're trying to understand ourselves and what's going through our minds and what we're doing and why we're doing it. And we're also trying to understand the broader physical and especially social situations in which we engage in these kinds of social interactions. But the kind of working assumption through all of this is that in social cognition, as well as in non-social cognition, there is a reality out there in the world that we're trying to figure out. If I'm trying to figure out whether you're extroverted or neurotic or like me or don't like me, there's a fact about the matter that I'm going to be more or less able to comprehend. The basic idea is that the reality we're trying to understand has an existence that's independent of the knower. And the point of this lecture, for those of you who want to leave early, is that's not clear that that's the case with social cognition. The philosophical roots of this problem go way back into the history of modern philosophy and the debate, if that's what it was, between 2 classes of philosophers, realists on the one hand and idealists on the other hand. The basic realist stance is nicely captured by Immanuel Kant, who basically assumed that the objects of perception exist independently of our perception of them. That is, that our perception of the world is a more or less accurate, more or less veridical representation of the world outside our minds. That view was opposed by Bishop Berkeley, after whom Berkeley's named, who put forth a view that's now known as idealism, which basically argued that the objects of perception are dependent on our own perceptual processes, that they don't really exist independent of our minds. And there's a softer version of this, which we'll come back to in a little while, that makes a distinction between the intrinsic properties of objects and certain properties that are Q-dependent. But Bishop Berkeley himself took a fairly strong stance here, arguing that none of the properties of the world, the objects of the world, existed independent of our perception of them. Okay, so that's where all this all comes from. And this debate also kind of plays itself out in what the French philosopher Ernst Cassirer called the Enlightenment stance, the kind of philosophical stance that emerged in Europe and the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries, which basically argued that humans had the capacity to reason their way to correct knowledge. And this Enlightenment stance is usually one that's contrasted with the stance that people took in the medieval period, the so-called Dark Ages, where the knowledge that you had was acquired through authority. Your king or your prince or your bishop or your church or whatever told you what was true, and you believed it because these authority figures told you what was true. But the philosophers of the Enlightenment argued that no, individuals could acquire true knowledge simply by virtue of their own capacity for reason. A view that goes all the way back to Descartes, who tried to reason his way to true knowledge, adopting a stance of kind of disciplined skepticism, saying I'm not going to believe anything unless I can figure it out for myself. Okay, so the whole idea behind the Enlightenment stance is that the central mental capacity that humans have is the capacity for reason, and it's only by virtue of reason that we are able to think correct thoughts and engage in correct behaviors. The Enlightenment philosophers basically argued that human beings were rational by nature, and that we could use our reason to make progress from wherever we are now, whatever our imperfect state is, to some kind of state of perfection. They also asserted that all human beings were equally rational, that is, everybody had the capacity to do this, and they argued that there should be some kind of tolerance for other people's beliefs, because everybody was on the same path toward trying to reason their way to true knowledge, and they were especially tolerant of whatever beliefs people had that were based on reason. If you said, well, I believe this because my mother told me, or I believe this because my priest told me, or I believe this because my king told me, those are rational beliefs. The only truly rational beliefs are ones that you acquired through the operation of your own rational capacities. Okay, so we're going to not focus on this a lot, but the general idea here is that what you want to do is to get rid of local prejudices. Okay, there's a kind of universalistic flavor to the Enlightenment stand. Everybody's rational. Everybody has the capacity to acquire true knowledge. Everybody has the capacity to make progress towards perfection. There was very little tolerance for the idea that well, different people could reason in different ways at different times in history. Very little tolerance for the idea that different cultures reasoned in different ways. Everybody was alike, and everybody had the capacity to come to the same kinds of views. And there was also in the 17th and 18th century a de-emphasis on the intuitive and kind of on the artistic. It was a kind of a rebellion from 18th century Enlightenment views that kind of led to the Romantic period in the 19th century, which really spent a lot of time on irrational, emotional bases for thought and action. Okay, we're going somewhere here, because modern science is predicated on this Enlightenment stance, because the implication of the Enlightenment stance is that what's true is true always and everywhere for everybody. Okay, and science is the great epitome of Enlightenment thinking. We're doing experiments and reasoning our way to a correct account of the nature of reality, and that the laws of nature that we uncover through the scientific process are the same always and everywhere for everybody. As the physicist Steven Weinberg has put it, any intelligent alien anywhere would have to come upon the same logical system as we have to explain the structure of protons and the nature of supernovae. Okay, that's what reason gets you. It's kind of a universalistic principle of getting at the truth. Okay, well, that might be true for a lot of reality, but it's not necessarily true for the kinds of reality that we're dealing with in a class like this, because it's very clear that when it comes to the social world, when it comes to social reality, there is an important role to be played by beliefs, which are not just beliefs about reality, but the beliefs that we have about reality create the beliefs that we have beliefs about. Okay, so there's this distinction in social cognition and social reality between what's subjective and what's objective, facts about ourselves and others and all of that. So far in this class, what we've been focusing on is the manner in which beliefs about the social world are acquired through perception and stored in memory and altered through various kinds of thought processes and communicated to other people through language. And what we want to do today, just for a brief moment, is to talk about the other part of this, which is how and to what extent our beliefs create the reality that we're trying to understand. Now, we've already had some introduction to this when we talked early on in the course about Robert K. Merton's notion of the self-fulfilling prophecy, or even earlier when you think about the Thomas theorem, where if men define situations as real, they are real for them. And Merton had the same kind of insight that definitions of a situation become an integral part of the situation and then affect subsequent developments. So that you can start out with a false definition, a false perception, an understanding of the situation that is inaccurate, and then what will happen is you'll behave on the basis of that inaccurate understanding of the situation, behave in such a way as to bring the situation in line with your inaccurate understanding of it, thereby making your understanding accurate. Okay, so that's basically what's going on, and it's probably the case that we can't create protons or supernovae just by thinking about the concept of protons and supernovae. But when we think about social reality, it turns out that the social reality we're trying to understand is, at least in substantial part, a product of our own beliefs. And again, we've talked about various mechanisms in which this self-fulfilling prophecy can work itself out. Merton wasn't a brilliant sociologist, but he wasn't really much interested in how these things worked out at the psychological level of analysis. But we now know that there's a whole set of so-called expectancy confirmation effects, where perceivers who have an expectancy about the world they're going to perceive act either overtly through their behavior or covertly through their mental processes to bring that world in line with their expectations. So in behavioral confirmation, we can elicit from other people actual behavior that confirms our expectations of them. So we're creating a public reality. If I treat somebody in such a way as to confirm my expectation of them, that behavior that they display that confirms my expectation is something everybody else can see too. They can see, oh yeah, that's right, he's like this or he's like that. Or in the case of when the target's behavior is ambiguous, we have a set of perceptual confirmation processes where I can interpret the target's behaviors as if they were consistent with my expectations. And here, what's happening is, by virtue of perceptual confirmation, I'm creating a private reality. I'm bringing my mental representation of reality in line with in line with my expectations and beliefs. In either case, whether we're creating a public reality or creating a private reality, beliefs are creating a reality. Okay, beliefs are creating a reality that we're trying to understand. Okay, so just to kind of expand on this for another second or two, we've seen a couple of different ways in which this kind of thing can happen. We saw in the lectures on social perception that, to a large extent, especially social perception, is constructive in nature. That what the perceiver has to do is to go beyond the information given by the stimulus. The stimulus is not self-evidently what it is. We have to fill in the gaps. We have to interpret vague and ambiguous features, and in that way, we construct the reality to which we respond. Similarly, in memory, we reconstruct in memory a mental representation of past event, and so it's that memory that guides our behavior in the future. It's not the past event. The past is past. Okay, as far as the objective fact is concerned, my behavior is going to be determined by my memory of the past. That's the reality that controls my behavior. And then just last week, we talked about George Kelly's idea of constructive alternativism, that we can, to some extent, choose the constructs that serve as a filter on our perceptions of various kinds of events, and construing an event one way will lead us to behave with respect to that event in one way, construing the event another way will lead us to behave with respect to that event in some entirely different way. If I think about somebody as a study partner, I'm going to behave towards him or her in a very different way than if I think about this person as a date. Okay, that's just the way it is. And I have these alternative ways of constructing that particular person or constructing that situation. Okay, so that's the whole idea behind the Kelly work that we talked about last time, that events can be construed in multiple ways, and we have the ability to choose how we're going to construe them. We have the ability to set aside old constructs. We have the ability to acquire new ones. But whatever constructs we apply, they're going to determine how we behave, because the construal is the subjective reality, and the subjective reality is going to determine how we're going to behave. Okay, so just to remind you that most of the time in this class we've been talking about only one aspect of social cognition, which is how we understand reality. What are the perceptual and memory and learning processes, the thought processes that we use to figure out what's going on in the social world around us. But it also becomes clear that at the same time as we're trying to cognize, okay, we're trying to understand social reality, we're also constructing, we're also affecting the very thing that we're trying to understand. And this has proved to be a very difficult proposition for people to get their heads around, and I'm no exception to this. In modern era, which is sometimes called postmodern era, the modern philosophers thought that there was an objective reality that we were trying to figure out with our minds. Postmodern philosophers sometimes want to suggest that there really isn't anything like an objective reality anyway. Okay, so the transition we want to make now is to kind of another level of constructivism, to get beyond what we might call the individual brand of constructivism, which takes place in the individual's mind as he or she constructs an object in perception, reconstructs it in memory, and reconstructs it again through the mechanisms of constructive alternativism. There is a social variant on constructivism that puts the emphasis, puts the focus outside the individual, and argues that there are not only are our representations of the world products of our own individual cognitive constructions, but to some extent our representations of the world are the product of social forces that in which our own thought and action are embedded. Let's talk about that a little bit. Okay. So that leads us to what you might call the post-Enlightenment stance in philosophy and culture at large. Whereas the Enlightenment stance argued that there were universal objective truths that anybody could reach by using the power of his or her own individual reason. The Enlightenment stance celebrates the individual more than anything else. There is, these days, what you might call a post-Enlightenment stance that tends to deny the existence of universal objective truths, that denies what Steven Weinberg argued, that any alien anywhere would come up with the same concept of protons and supernovae that we have, that somehow these ideas are historically contingent, that even scientific knowledge is contingent on being at a particular place in a particular time. And that focuses on classification as not trying to understand the inherent structure of things, but rather just applying a label to something. And that label is kind of a proxy for genuine understanding. Whereas the Enlightenment stance that characterizes most scientific activity argues that the nature of reality is something to be discovered. Okay, this post-Enlightenment stance says that the nature of reality is imposed on reality by social forces, that there is some kind of historical, social, and cultural creation of reality that's important. Okay, so here's an example of this. This is a famous example, and it's probably the most familiar example for those who've got this idea at all. We can first think about gender as a biological fact. We know that gender has to do with, gender is determined by our chromosomal heritage. We're either chromosomally XX or chromosomally XY, and that chromosomal endowment has consequences for our hormonal endowment, fetal sex hormones like testosterone and other androgens. That fetal hormonal endowment has consequences for our physical morphology, primary and secondary sex characteristics, our physique, the nature of our genitalia, and that these also determine various kinds of individual and social behaviors having to do with gender identity, whether you identify yourself as a man or a woman or a boy or a girl, or gender role, or your conception of masculinity, your sexual orientation, or whatever. All of this, according to one view, flows from a single biological fact, which is what your chromosomal heritage is, and that's a matter that's observer independent. Okay, it's just a fact of the world that you're genetically XX or genetically XY, except for the 0.2% of the population who aren't. Okay. By the same token, the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote a very important book in 1947 that really kind of gets this stuff going in an important way, called The Second Sex, in which she argues that gender is not a biological fact, but rather gender is something that's socially constructed. The famous de Beauvoir quote, okay, one is not born a woman, rather one becomes a woman. Her argument being that yes, there are biological differences between the sexes, but these biological differences, the genes and the chromosomes and the hormones and all that kind of stuff, don't really determine the gender. They don't determine whether people are going to turn out to be masculine or feminine. They don't determine whether people are going to turn out to be heterosexual or homosexual. All of that is something that occurs through essentially a socialization process. And she argued, as others have argued since her, that gendered attributes, masculinity, femininity, gender identity, sexual orientation, all that stuff is basically highly contingent on history and social structure. If you were born at a different time, you'd be a different kind of man or a different kind of woman. If you were born in a different culture, you'd be a different kind of man or a different kind of woman. All of this is historically and culturally contingent. Okay, so that gives people, that's just one example of this. Another example is the social construction of race. We, even in a place like Berkeley, we still talk about races as if they meant something. You have to indicate your race on your application form. Those of you who filled out your census form still had to indicate what race you had. But there's a general consensus among biologists that race really isn't a biological concept, that the differences, the biological differences between what we call different races are minuscule. Yeah, somebody's got a gene for lactose intolerance, somebody's got a gene for malaria prevention or whatever, but outside of that, we're basically all built the same. And that the racial distinctions that we make are really highly contingent on both where you are in historical time and also where